Hello, everyone. This is the Join the Light Side TV with your host, Michael. Today, we're going to be engaging in the first part of a multi-part series, which is looking at the sort of forms that Marxism has taken in modern day society and sort of the ailments that come with. And I suppose that with today, we're going to be looking at it more in terms of what it looks like in our institutions and some social programs. Now, we're going to first start with the sort of the topic of degradation, degeneration, and destruction. Now, one of the first places that you first see this in, and I'm sure that this is almost painfully obvious to examine, is to the extent of which within just North America alone, looking at our political institutions, like just how far they've fallen since the recent candidates have been sworn in. Within the US, we have Joe Biden, and in Canada, we have Justin Trudeau. So, not only to mention with our political institutions, we also have our educational institutions that are also falling prey to this vicious ideological belief. I can certainly speak to that in my own experience with currently attending a post-secondary institution and the level of how prevalent it is within there. And not to mention that a lot of these sort of figures that are being propped up, even in seemingly value neutral subjects, or they really should be anyway. And the educators themselves, I'm pretty sure quite a few of them are not even aware of some of the people that they're propping up. Someone who I thought was actually pretty value neutral up until recently. I did some reading into it myself. Somebody who is quite prominent in mentioning within developmental research in modern post-secondary institutions, whose name goes by Lev Vygotsky. He is known by the zone of proximal development, which is sort of the idea that reasonable zone of which an individual can develop, and then if you were to help scaffold, as he phrases, then it could be a reasonable assumption that somebody who has proper guidance can take up their own sort of mastery in a given subject. Now, that initial proposition isn't exactly controversial or contentious. You could certainly see that being appealing, on the grounds of it being objectively true. It's more of the implications of the character that follow around him. It's actually back in Vygotsky's time. This is also something that you could look into yourself. He was actually a social activist back in, I think it was about the 60s or so. He was a avid socialist, which, in that time, especially the place where he was a champion for Bolshevism in the Soviet Union. And if you need to go and research just how horrible the Soviet Union is, you can certainly go and do that yourself. I'm not going to go into that in detail in at least this podcast, but that sort of speaks for itself. Now, there is more to say with what I was regarding to before I was talking about Vygotsky. There's a lot of these sort of empty phrased ideals that are being pushed, especially in our social institutions, that, you see these sorts of phrases everywhere where the term sustainability is everywhere, equity, inclusion, these sorts of phrases. And when you first see them, it's kind of seems like it's a no-brainer, like especially within like the sort of countries that we've had up to this point, at least for the past like 50 years or so. Like we've been operating with a reasonable degree of freedom. Of course, there is four sorts of things that could be reformed and made better. By no means do we live in a perfected society or utopia, which that is definitely a dangerous proposition to be giving, especially like these days. And that is largely the spirit that inhabits these people that offer up these sorts of ideas. That's sort of the end goal. And not only is that like completely unattainable, it also is just like what people are willing to make that happen, like the level of sacrifice that would they would deem that is necessary for that to happen, is exactly the sort of predications that came from like the Great Leap Forward in communist China back in like that started in the 50s, and that resulted just from starvation alone up to 55 million deaths, and that's like a pretty conservative estimate, especially with just how populated the country was. So I'll leave that subject right there. Another like very contentious point that I think that is very prevalent within our sort of political discussions and open discourse is just the blatant cynicism and pessimism that inhabits like so many people. And I think that's actually what some of the Marxist types would call the zeitgeist, like the spirit that inhabits the times. And I think that is very much what we're facing right now, is just the whole notion that like every social institution, unless it's like on the right side of history, is predicated on the pursuit of like tyrannical power. And I think that is a very dangerous proposition to be playing with, especially where that sort of responsibility is abdicated. That's when a tyrant is going to swoop right in and vacuum up all of that responsibility. And that's actually a very popular quote by Jordan Peterson. I can't take that as my own, but that much is obvious that we see in our current society. Now, speaking more to that, I think that also has been fueling into a form of pathological paternalism that has been inhabited in the state. And I think that has been much more obvious in the last few years in the re-election of the Canadian and US government, where you have these like stimulus checks that are sent out, and like this money that's effectively coming from nowhere. They're printing off money, and they're actually creating like inflation for the country. And it's obvious that these sorts of things, they're not working. So they need to be abandoned as soon as possible, and we need to be lowering the tax rate for like the general citizens. We have a government that is becoming overinflated and not really doing anything to help anybody. They have an egregious immigration plan that they have coming through, where people that have been applying for sometimes up to years, they're having their visas ignored, and people who are like trying to get in at the borders that haven't even tried to undergo the whole process of obtaining a visa like legally and if like properly, they're getting ignored and sidebarred. And these people that are coming up at the borders, they're just being let in. And like, this is very speculative. I'm going to say that as a disclaimer. that I think that this is a purposed attempt to create a form of destabilization within the country. Again, I state that this is speculative. I don't have proof for this. So I think that is a reasonable thing to think, though, just in terms of the sort of power grabs that have been demonstrated by the current government system that we have. Now, I think that there also needs to be something mentioned about, especially in the modern era, the death of meaning. So we have these the concepts of like double speak being inhabited, especially by these people that are trying to pursue these agendas. We have common sense seemingly being taken advantage of, that we hear these terms like equity and inclusion, diversity, etc., and we automatically assume that it's for a greater good. Now, these Marxist types, they're very much taking advantage of the convoluted meaning that they've now adapted to it, where they've there's this one quote that I believe it's James Lindsay has said, which, shout out to James Lindsay. I'm wearing his New Discourses t-shirt. He was saying that the Marxists, they use your vocabulary, but not your dictionary. So they mean different by these sorts of things. So there's that. And I think that the death of meaning also is being applied to things like just concepts like the use of safe spaces in university. Now, I am not a champion of these sort of settings. I think that they create a complete opposite effect of what they're trying to do. Now, I place that within that being a part of the death of meaning, because it's like implying that it's a good thing with the use of the word safe. But all it really is just it's sheltering people against like challenging their ideas and seeing if they actually like go through scrutiny and rigor, which is exactly what the university and colleges are supposed to be for. It's supposed to be a proverbial battleground for these sorts of ideas, for them to duke it out, and like the bad ideas should go there to die. And I think that's precisely what should be happening with the level of tyrannical socialism that's being adapted in our institutions and in our government. But of course, these sorts of ideas, they're being actively stifled. And there's actually some bills that are being put out right now to try and do exactly that. So I'm hoping that my video will not be striked in cause of this, but I suppose we'll see. A mention of like how there is the destabilization also of just basic categories. This still falls under the topic of the death of meaning. We have basic biological categories that are being challenged in the strangest of ways, and these categories are actually incredibly important and useful, especially in terms of scientific research and how they affect like everyday citizens, especially within like the realm of like just even with the studies of things like COVID medicine. Like you have these really strange academic studies that are now coming out where they apply this critical constructivist lens, and they like basically like put out a red herring where they're like not even actually really talking about the real science. They're just like, they have like sort of what was an example that I was hearing about this other day? I think it was like molecular biology and how they were like, some Marxists were like basically implying that like, oh, like the focus shouldn't even be on the study. It should be on like the fact that this this field is predominantly male ran, and that like we shouldn't even be focusing on that. We should be trying to make it more equitable, and basically just like mass disruption and like actually trying to create real progress where like both males and females alike within this field, they probably hear this absolute garbage and they're just wanting to do their bloody job and actually try to make lives better, as opposed to just like drawing attention to seemingly arbitrary things at this time. Now, that aside, I think that there's also a root that is tied to queer theory in this respect, where I'm not precisely talking about it in terms of it being practiced in sort of like the layman, where like I think that actually not many people actually know what it means to be queer in the academic sense. And in the academic sense, it is blatantly terrifying just how destructive this idea is, where it literally tries to blur lines between different discrete categories, and it tries to actually, it has a very similar conceptual frame as does Marxism, which is actually why people like James Lindsay have been referring to queer studies as queer Marxism. As it is, it views the world that there is a special kind of knowledge or gnosis that is sort of propped up by cis normativity and access to that special information that like keeps them in the center, and that in order for them to gain access to this sort of gnosis, they need to decentralize normalcy. That's how they phrase it, in that in order to do that, it basically has to undergo it will ultimately turn into a violent revolution, but they're talking about revolution, and that's revolutions never go over well. Reform is one thing, revolution is a complete other catastrophe. Now, it is also interesting to note the just dramatic irony that comes out from them trying to basically wholly dispense with categorization when what they're actually doing is a form of categorization. So, and the iron law of woke projection never misses. It's quite funny when you think about it. And that there's also this idea in our education system. It first started within our colleges of education, and then it started to move more into the K to 12 system, more so from what I understand, and starting from about the 90s. I'm currently reading a book actually called The Marxification of Education by James Lindsay. It is a very informative read so far. I've yet to finish it, but I will certainly be doing a review when I finish that book. Now, as I was saying, these sorts of ideas are certainly manifesting within our school system. The ideas that are backed by Marxism. One critical pedagogist, I believe that's how you'd say it. He goes by the name of Paulo Freire. He is a Brazilian Marxist and post-colonialist who is informed by Marx and also one Frantz Fanon. That is another quite terrifying figure that I actually had the displeasure of reading in one of my philosophy classes, and he is a deeply like troubled and extremely angry man who lived back in the 60s. Maybe I'll do another podcast on him, but that's a whole other can of worms to address. So like this man, Paulo Freire, he has been much of the force that has been driven in like overhauling the educational paradigm that's been taking place in North America. And that is why, like, seemingly that our legibility rates have been plummeting, mathematical skills have been plummeting, people's mental health states have been plummeting as well. Like, it's not a good day in a once functional society where people can't even read like effectively for themselves or like do basic problem solving. That is a huge problem. And I understand there is some resistance on the front where people, they have grievances about like learning information that they feel like they'll never use in the present world. But there is certainly utility to be able to roundabout mentalize problem solving in that sort of respect. And there's also a utility of like having gone through that sort of program and like learning to like delay gratification, that you can't always just have milk and honey all the time. So there's utility in that. Also, just I find it quite strange, and I would like to hear your guys' opinion on this in the comments below if you'd like. Just the fact that like we have currently a educational model that is taking what is traditionally that would be learned within like the household and the sort of customs that they want to adopt with their family, and now they're creating this strange government implemented socialization program, which is, from what I can tell, it is quite deeply pathological. It has a really good sales pitch. If you go to the what is called the Castle website, it is the Collaborative Association for Social Emotional Learning. I can't remember what it stood for, but basically, if you go on that website, it has the 5 core competencies. It all sounds well and good. It says that it has like evidence-based backing to it, but in reality, they are basing all this off of like just a few studies, and they like were able to cherry pick that within the few studies it seemed to like bode well, and there's actually some where they went horribly wrong. There's a study that actually went about in Nigeria where they implemented this sort of model, a generative themes model that's based off of Paulo Freire's system, and it actually like heavily radicalized the people within the classroom. It turned them into emotional wrecks. That was the phrasing of the researchers behind that project, and they're, from what I can tell, they're so ideologically possessed that despite the horrible outcome that came from this study, they still recommended that this be applied to like a broader model. So the fact that that's a thing is like jarring to think about. Like, I think if we actually want to be able to have a more like cohesive society, it should be left to the parents to adopt the sort of traditions and customs that they want with their kids, and they can find a form of stability with that, as opposed to this weird external force that's like being foisted upon them. And it's already, for one, Malthusian in approach. It has a very pessimistic view on humanity that believes that we're not even capable of like being left to our own devices to a degree, which I suppose that there is some like implementation that should be put in, but like to the extent of which they're taking it and how they're basically like doing a bait and switch with our education model. It's terrible to see. And lastly, I'll mention with social emotional learning that there's actually research that indicates that there's surveys being distributed to the children that are taking these programs, and it's essentially a data mining operation. It's examining like these sort of phrases that causes like upset in the children, and potential words that can like radicalize them. And it is to quote the World Economic Forum that actually like champions this program. They believe that with implementing this program, they can create, and I believe this is the quote, forecastable economic units. Those are your kids, by the way, which is a very cold deliverance of viewing like such like innocent like beings that shouldn't have to be like exposed to this kind of stuff. This is absolutely ridiculous and absurd. Like, I can't believe that I have to come out and say this along with so many other people that are against this, but this is the world that we currently live in. And not to mention that these sorts of programs are actually much resembling the same sort of pattern that went about in the Maoist revolution that happened in China, like starting with like the Great Leap Forward. Like you have, for instance, like in our colleges of education, colleges and universities, that there is a development of what is analogous to the Red Guard in Maoist China, where you have these lesson layouts that are incredibly socialist and like communist in their root, and creating a giant sympathizer base. And they're essentially, and by they I mean like globalists, like the World Economic Forum, they're creating a top down demand, and also bottom up. The bottom up being with the social institutions, with the kids, they're basically demanding for this because that's what they're learning about. And then basically the top down movement is, oh, well, we've already been doing it. We didn't wait for your consent or for your like democratic like decision on this. Like, anyway, also there is a call for the dispensing of traditions, which was actually another part of the program that went into Maoist China. The destruction of the five olds is what that looked like, and you can go and read for that for yourself. It was absolutely horrible. There was a huge amount of like brainwashing that was going about, which in Chinese is Xinao, which quite literally means wash brain, which is, as it's put by the one psychologist, Robert J. Lifton, thought reform. And we're actually currently undergoing that with programs like DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion programs, or going through like the programs that are basically like critical race theory oriented, that it's basically like if you're like Caucasian, you should basically hate yourself and your heritage, even if it really didn't have anything to do with like oppressing anybody, which is a great deal of people. But apart from that, like, it's definitely terrifying to see that this is actually a part of the not just in the States but also in Canada, that there is a call for like the erasure of like our history. Like we have the 1619 project in the United States that is basically muddying the waters in terms of what is like historical accuracy. And from what I've been reading, there's a great deal that it gets wrong, for one, and another is that it's been radicalizing people to the extent of which they hate the country of which they're in, and that sort of creates that top-down facilitation along with that bottom-up, just like what they're trying to create, these globalists. That's a lot to dish out for today. This is the first subsection of this new part series that I'll be coming out with. I'm thinking of releasing the second part next Monday or Tuesday, so please stay tuned. If you could please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel, that would be absolutely wonderful. And please look out for each other out there. It's the times are getting tougher, turning more tumultuous. Recession is not getting any better. Definitely be mindful of your financial spending and take care of yourself and your family. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next week. Thank you.